It was the kind of October in rural Ohio that makes people understand why their grandparents never left. The maples along Route 83 had gone deep red. The air carried the particular cold sweetness of drying cornfields and wood smoke. And in the town of Killbuck, population 640, the weekend of October 17th, 1986, had the quality of something you'd want to hold on to a little longer than it lasted. The Vance family had been planning the house renovation for 2 years. Meredith and Gerald Vance had raised 3 children in the white 2-story on Elm Cross Road, had patched it and painted it and replaced the gutters twice. And now that the youngest was off to Columbus and the house was theirs again, in a way it hadn't been for 20 years, Gerald had decided the time had finally come to open up the west wall of the living room and run proper insulation before another winter arrived. It was a weekend project, a father and son project. Their oldest, Kevin, 26, was driving down from Worcester on Saturday morning with his truck and his tools and the particular good humor of a young man who was genuinely pleased to spend 2 days working beside his father. Meredith had promised chili. Gerald had rented a reciprocating saw from the hardware store on Thursday. Everything was in order. Everything was ready. On Saturday morning, Kevin arrived at 8:15. By noon, they had the drywall off the west wall down to the studs. And inside the wall cavity, resting in the pink insulation that had been there since the house was last renovated in 1971, was a coin. An old coin. A 1921 Morgan silver dollar, blackened with age, wrapped in a small square of cloth. And beneath the cloth, tucked into the same cavity in a sealed plastic bag that had not fully done its job, were 3 pages of handwritten paper. Kevin held the bag up to the light coming through the gap in the wall. Gerald stood beside him. They both read enough of what was on those pages to understand, in the particular vertiginous way of people who have found something that cannot be unfound, that the house they had lived in for 22 years had been keeping a secret. By Sunday morning, the Killbuck police had been called. By Tuesday, the Holmes County Sheriff's Office had opened an investigation. And by the following spring, nothing in the Vance family would ever be the same again. Holmes County, Ohio sits in the quiet heart of the state's Amish country, and in 1986 it operated with a pace and a character that were already a kind of deliberate anachronism. Horse-drawn buggies on county roads, hand-lettered signs on farm stands, a social fabric woven tight enough that most families had known each other for 3 and 4 generations without interruption. Killbuck was one of the smaller communities in the county, more crossroads than town, with a feed store, a post office, a Methodist church that doubled as a community center, and the kind of institutional memory that lives in the heads of people who have stayed in the same place long enough to remember everything. Gerald Vance had grown up in Killbuck and had never seriously considered leaving. He ran a small plumbing supply business out of a workshop behind the house, drove a decade-old Chevy pickup, and was known by everyone in the county as a man of his word, who charged fair prices and kept his appointments. Meredith had been a Millersburg girl who had moved to Killbuck when she married Gerald in 1957 and had adopted the town with the full commitment of someone who has made a decision and means it. She taught Sunday school at the Methodist Church for 18 years. She grew dahlias and black-eyed Susans in a garden along the south fence that neighbors stopped to admire on summer evenings. She made chili from a recipe that had come from her own mother's mother, and that she had never written down because she considered writing it down an act of pessimism about her own longevity. The house on Elm Cross Road had belonged, before the Vances, to a man named Arthur Liddon, who had owned it from 1952 until his death in 1963. And before that, to a family named Sutter, who had built it in the early 1940s. Gerald had bought it in 1964 from Arthur Liddon's estate. He had always liked the bones of it, Wide plank floors, solid oak doors, a staircase that didn't creak regardless of where you stepped. He had lived in it for 22 years without knowing what was in the west wall. Kevin Vance, 26 years old in 1986, was a machinist in Worcester who had his father's hands and his mother's instinct for getting along with people. He had been home for Thanksgiving the previous year and had made the chili because Meredith had a bad back that week, and he'd gotten the proportions slightly wrong. And Meredith had been gently and methodically correcting him on the subject ever since. He had 2 younger sisters, both grown and living out of state. He had a girlfriend in Worcester named Pam. He had, in the normal accounting of a 26-year-old man in a good season of his life, no preparation for what was inside that wall. That Saturday morning in October was the last one on which the Vance family was simply a family. By the following week, they would be something harder to name. Gerald pulled the plastic bag from the insulation himself. He had to reach in past the 1971-era batting to get it. It had been lodged between a cross stud and the exterior sheathing, set there rather than fallen in the deliberate way of something placed. Kevin held the flashlight. The bag was a standard kitchen zipper bag, degraded along one side, but the contents had survived better than they had any right to. Inside, folded into thirds, were 3 sheets of paper covered in handwriting, blue ink, cursive, and in places smeared but largely legible. The 1921 Morgan dollar was wrapped in a piece of flannel shirt, gray-blue plaid, cut into a square about the size of a playing card. Gerald read the first page standing at the wall. Kevin read it beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. What was on those pages was a confession, a private confession, written in 1971. The date was at the top of the first page, by a man identifying himself only by his initials, W.A.L. The confession described, in careful and specific detail, the circumstances surrounding the death of a woman named Patrice Dunnigan in the late spring of 1969. The death, the writer stated, had been ruled an accident. It had not been an accident. He described what had happened. He described where Patrice Dunnigan had been living at the time. He described his own role. And then he described why he had not come forward, and what he had done instead, and why he was writing it down now and sealing it in this wall, not as a confession to authorities, but as a record, a private accounting for which he expected no mercy and sought none. At the bottom of the third page, below the initials W.A.L., was a single line. She was 24 years old, and she had a daughter, and I have carried this every day. Gerald set the pages down on the floor beside the open wall. He looked at his son. He looked at the coin in his own hand, tarnished silver, 1921, still wrapped in its square of flannel. Kevin said nothing. Gerald went to the kitchen and called the Kilbuck Police non-emergency line and told the dispatcher that they had found something in their wall and needed someone to come by. 3 hours later, the pages were in an evidence bag. The coin was in a separate one. The flannel was in a third. Detective Corporal Wayne Stills of the Holmes County Sheriff's Office was in the living room with a legal pad, and the west wall of the Vance house was standing open to the October afternoon. Patrice Ann Dunnigan, 24 years old. The name appeared in Holmes County records from the spring of 1969, specifically in a death certificate filed on May 28th of that year listing the cause of death as accidental drowning in a private pond on property in Wayne County, just over the county line. The case had been handled by the Wayne County Sheriff's Office and had been closed within 3 weeks of the incident. No investigation beyond the initial inquiry, no evidence of foul play documented. 2 witnesses at the scene had confirmed the account of what happened, and those witnesses had been accepted without contradiction. Patrice had been living at the time on a rented property on the Holmes-Wayne County line, working part-time at a fabric shop in Millersburg and raising a daughter, age 2, on her own after the child's father had left the previous year. She was from Cleveland originally, a city girl who had come to Holmes County for reasons that the people who knew her casually described in the 1969 inquiry as personal. She had a few friends in Millersburg. She attended services at a church in Holmesville sometimes. She was not deeply embedded in the community's social fabric, which meant, in the cold practical terms of a 1969 county inquiry, that the circle of people with both knowledge of her life and motivation to press for a thorough investigation was small. Detective Stills was 53 years old and had worked Holmes County for 26 years. He had the careful manner of someone who had seen enough to understand that the gap between what happened and what was documented was frequently larger than the official record suggested, especially in cases from the 1960s involving women who were not known to the right people. He pulled the original Wayne County file. It was thin. 2 witness statements, the coroner's report, a 2-page incident summary. The case had been worked and closed in the way that 1969 rural Ohio occasionally worked and closed things involving people who had no one to make noise on their behalf. The initials WAL took Stills 11 days to resolve. Property records. The 1971 renovation permit for the house on Elm Cross Road, and a cross-reference against the county's registry of residents from that period identified the most probable match as Walter Arthur Linden, a Killbuck area contractor who had done residential renovation work throughout Holmes and Wayne counties in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Walter Linden had died in 1979. He had no surviving children. His wife Edna had died in 1984. He had done renovation work on the Vance house in 1971. The permit was on file. The timing of the confession, written 2 years after Patrice Dunnigan's death, sealed in a wall he had access to during a job he could document having completed, aligned without ambiguity. The institutional failure was this. In 1969, the 2 witnesses at the Wayne County Pond had been Walter Linden's brother-in-law and a man named Dale Pritchett, who had worked for Linden's contracting business since 1965. Neither connection had been disclosed during the original inquiry. The Wayne County investigator in 1969 had not asked. And because Patrice Dunnigan was a woman from Cleveland with a 2-year-old daughter and no family in the county to ask on her behalf, nobody had pushed back. Meanwhile, in the Vance house on Elm Cross Road, Gerald had begun a kind of private excavation that Meredith watched with quiet alarm. He had been inside this house for 22 years. He had patched its walls and fixed its pipes and raised his children inside it and never considered that the house itself had a history he didn't know. He began calling people, old neighbors, people who had known Arthur Linden, people who remembered the Sutters. Meredith understood what he was doing. He was trying to establish whether he had lived, innocently, inside the physical record of something wrong. And she understood that the answer was not going to help him feel better, and she told him so gently. And he kept calling anyway. By 1990, 4 years had passed, and the legal possibilities had been fully exhausted. Walter Linden was dead. His brother-in-law was dead. Dale Pritchett was alive, residing in Worcester. But the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office had reviewed the file and determined that the written confession, while compelling in its moral weight, did not meet the evidentiary threshold for charges against a living person in the absence of physical evidence connecting Pritchett directly to an act that the original record listed as accidental. The case was not prosecutable. That determination was delivered in a letter. It was 2 paragraphs long. Stills kept the file. He retired in 1997, but kept a photocopy of the confession, all 3 pages, in the same home office drawer where he kept his pension documents and his fishing licenses. He read it every year or so, not searching for anything he hadn't already found, but for the same reason that people return to certain kinds of difficult things. Because the reading was a form of witness, and witness, even private and unofficial, was what the situation required. The family fracture the title promises was this. Kevin Vance had, in the months following the discovery, attempted to locate Patrice Dunnigan's daughter. The child, a girl named Rosemary, 2 years old in 1969, would have been in her late teens by 1986. Kevin found, through a combination of public records and correspondence with a Catholic Children's Services organization in Columbus, that Rosemary had been placed with a foster family in Summit County after her mother's death, and had been adopted in 1971 under a new surname. He had the name. He had an address that was 3 years out of date. He did not contact her. He told no one he had found it. He put the address in an envelope and kept it in his desk drawer in Worcester for 11 years, which is how long it took him to decide what to do with it. Gerald and Meredith did not separate. They were not that kind of family, and this was not that kind of fracture. But the house on Elm Cross Road had changed in a way that was real and specific, and that people who visited after 1986 sometimes noticed without being able to name. The living room wall had been repaired, the new insulation properly installed, the drywall replaced and painted. Everything looked the same. Nothing felt the same. By 1995, Meredith had moved her Sunday school class, which she had conducted from the front room of the house for 3 years, to the church fellowship hall instead. She did not explain the change. Gerald drove past Walter Linden's old workshop site on Route 83 more than he needed to for at least 4 years. By 2002, 33 years had passed since Patrice Dunnigan drowned in a private pond in Wayne County. And the world that had produced the 2-paragraph letter and the thin 1969 file felt, to anyone who read it now, like a different country. Some things, in that different country, had changed. The Ohio Attorney General's Cold Case Unit had been formally established. DNA processing times had come down. The legal standard for reopening a death ruling on the basis of new documentary evidence had been refined through precedent. And Wayne Stills, retired and 70 years old, had sent a letter to the Ohio AG's office in Columbus with 3 photocopied pages attached and a 1-paragraph note explaining what they were and where they had come from and why he believed they deserved a second look. He did not expect a response in under a year. He received one in 4 months. Then, in the fall of 2003, a woman named Assistant Attorney General Denise Corman was assigned to review the Dunnigan file. And on a Thursday afternoon, she pulled the original Wayne County case documents, read the 1969 witness statements, and then looked at the names on those statements and looked at a property records database on her screen and made, quietly and without drama, the connection between Dale Pritchett and the Linden contracting business that the 1969 investigator had never been asked to make. Pritchett was 71 years old. He was living in Worcester. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research. Cross-referencing records, locating sources, tracing connections across decades that were never meant to be traced. If that work matters to you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. And tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We read everyone. Now, let's go back to what Denise Corman found. The process of building a case around a document sealed in a wall for 32 years required Corman and the AG's office investigators to do something the 1969 inquiry had never bothered to do: establish, with precision, what Dale Pritchett had actually been doing on the property on the day Patrice Dunnigan died, and whether the account he had given then, corroborated only by a man related to the person he was corroborating for, held up against documents and records that had never been examined together. It did not hold up. Not completely. Not in 3 specific particulars that the AG's office investigators identified over the course of a 4-month review. A fuel receipt placing Pritchett's truck on a road inconsistent with his stated location during one portion of the afternoon. A handwritten entry in Walter Linden's personal ledger, recovered from estate records stored at a Kilbuck attorney's office, suggesting a meeting between Linden and Pritchett on the morning of the date in question that both had omitted from their 1969 statements, and a single additional document that had the quality of decisive weight. A letter from Patrice Dunnigan to a friend in Cleveland, written 3 weeks before her death, describing a confrontation she had recently had with a man she identified by first name only, Dale, over something she did not specify, but described as something that he could not afford to have come out. The letter had been in the friend's possession for 34 years. The friend, a woman named Constance Webb, who was 66 years old and living in Lakewood, Ohio, had not known what to do with it after Patrice died and the inquiry closed so quickly. She had kept it in a shoebox. When the AG's office contacted her, she produced it within the hour. Dale Pritchett was interviewed at his home in Worcester on a Tuesday morning in November of 2003 by 2 investigators from the AG's office and a detective from the Wayne County Sheriff's Office. He had not spoken to anyone officially about the Dunnigan matter since 1969. He was 71. He sat in his kitchen in a house he had lived in for 30 years and answered questions for 2 hours and said very little. At the end of the interview, one of the investigators placed a photocopy of Walter Linden's confession on the kitchen table and pushed it toward him. Pritchett looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Walter always was too careful with things." He said nothing else for 40 minutes. Then his attorney arrived and advised him to stop talking, which he did. The case was referred to the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office for charging consideration. In March of 2004, Dale Pritchett was charged with involuntary manslaughter and obstruction of justice for his role in the events of May 1969. He entered a no-contest plea in September of 2004 and was sentenced to 4 years in the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, with credit for time served during processing. He served 14 months before release on health grounds. He died in 2007. The community reaction in Holmes and Wayne counties was quiet, rather than loud. Not a town square moment, but a long exhale. The kind of response that moves through a community the way weather moves through a valley. Felt everywhere and named almost nowhere. People who had known Walter Linden, who had hired his contracting business, who had attended his wife's funeral, sat with what they now understood about the man who had put walls up in their homes. The Methodist Church in Kilbuck held no special service. There was no public statement from the county. There was only the record, which now said something different than it had before. Kevin Vance drove to Summit County in October of 2004 and hand-delivered the envelope to the last address he had for Rosemary Dunnigan, which turned out to be still current. She answered the door. She was 37 years old. He told her who he was and why he had come. He stood on her porch and handed her the envelope and told her, briefly and directly, what was in it and what had been done about it, and that he had been keeping this address for 11 years because he had not known how to arrive at her door until now. She took the envelope. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Come in." He did. Meredith Vance died in 2011. Before she did, she told Kevin, in one of their last clear conversations, that she had never blamed the house. She wanted him to know that. She had understood, she said, that the house was just a house, and that what was inside the wall had been put there by a man who had decided that documentation was a form of conscience, however inadequate, and that this decision, however insufficient, was at least a kind of reckoning. She did not forgive Walter Linden. She did not think forgiveness was hers to give. But she had stopped, sometime in the middle years, seeing the house as compromised. She had decided it was simply old, and that old things carry what has happened in them the way old people do, not as contamination, but as history. Gerald died in 2016. He had lived in the house on Elm Cross Road for 52 years. He had replaced the west wall drywall himself after the investigation concluded, and had painted it the same off-white it had always been, and had moved the couch back against it. He never spoke publicly about what was found. He was not, by nature, a man who believed that speaking publicly about difficult things accomplished much that the private management of them could not. But the coin, the 1921 Morgan silver dollar, returned to the family by the AG's office after the case closed. He kept on the mantel above the fireplace for the rest of his life. When visitors asked about it, he said it was old, which was true. Rosemary Dunnigan. She kept the name she had been given by her adoptive family and did not change it after the case resolved, which is its own kind of decision, spoke to a regional Ohio newspaper in 2005, a year after the plea. She said that she had not known, until Kevin arrived at her door, that there had been a confession. She said that knowing there had been a confession, that the man responsible had written it down and sealed it in a wall, was a more complicated kind of knowledge than she had expected. It was not comfort exactly, but it was not nothing. She said, "He thought someone should know. I think he was right about that much."